welcome to another Independent Minds event. And a special thank you to those of you who subscribe to The Independent. It does make a huge difference to us. It does sustain our free-thinking journalism. Helps us, I hope, take The Independent from strength to strength. And allows us to put on extra things like this that we have started doing in the last year or so. Now, tonight's date is obviously a poignant one. When we set this date, so we didn't really know what kind of event this was going to be. Was it going to be a wake? Was it going to be a party? Was it going to be a debate? We really didn't know. And we kind of worked out roughly what it was about 3 hours ago. So glad that's all completely clear. We are probably, everybody on stage that you see tonight has probably just done the hardest week of their working lives, I think. That's because some of them are journalists, some of them are political campaigners. One of them leads a political party, so that's probably not been a very easy week. I know from my part, one day this week, they've all merged into one. I was at home having breakfast and said to my 10-year-old daughter, sorry, would you mind just being a little bit quieter because I was trying to listen to the Today programme, and explained that they say a week's a long time in politics, but that this week felt a bit like a year because so much had changed, and I was just trying to keep on top of everything that had happened. And bright as a button, typically, she said back to me, "Go on then, Dad. What's changed this week?" Yeah, anyway, yeah, you'll go a long way, I thought, but yes, stop asking questions like that. But there are some certainties for now. For the rest of the weekend, almost certainly, this country is still part of the European Union. That's some news we can definitely confirm. We are going to, tomorrow morning's splash is going to be talking on the subject of a general election. So there's that to talk about tonight, whether we think that's going to happen. Who knows, there might be another meaningful vote, although the word meaningful seems to be it's a little bit stretched by now. But we're going to try and get through anything that you want us to get through, because the point of these evenings, we get to write about what we think you want to read. Hopefully we get it right most of the time. But tonight's your opportunity to really make sure that we do address any questions that you think we should. The format is that we have a kind of Ask Me Anything session with these people here, who I'll introduce in a minute. Then we have a campaigner who I met properly on Saturday at the march, and she's part of the youth campaign groups that I've found to be probably the most, maybe the only encouraging thing to have come out of the whole Brexit mess. I think that to see a generation of people so hugely engaged and really reinvigorating the centre ground, which is a kind of area of politics that the Independent has traditionally inhabited for most of its 30-year history. It's been a real blast, actually, to see these people step up. So Lara Spirit will be on stage soon. And then I get the pleasure of a discussion with Sir Vince Cable, who's come here from his surgery in Twickenham back into the centre of things. So thank you very much to you. Leading the first part of the session is John Rentoul, Chief Political Commentator of The Independent for a great number of years. And from the far side to the near side, Andrew Grice, former political editor of The Independent, now one of our regular deep thinkers about politics. And I'm right in saying the longest-serving member of the political lobby, the journalists who work in Westminster, of any paper, I believe, at the moment. That's right, isn't it? Great. Kim Sengupta, our defence and diplomatic editor. We have Lizzie Dearden, who I'm just going to have to remind myself of the precise title, Home Affairs and Security Correspondent, sorry, and our economics columnist, Hamish McRae, as well. So, John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. This event is being live streamed, So when we get to questions, can you wait for the microphone? Because otherwise, the millions of people watching out there won't get to hear your question. And if you want to tweet about it, the hashtag is #IndieBrexitDebate. So I'll very quickly ask our panel of experts to just say a few words about what Brexit means in their area of expertise, and then I shall open it up for questions, so get ready. Hamish, I remember a long time ago you invented the phrase that Brexit would probably mean that we'd move from being half in the European Union to being half out, and that it probably wouldn't have as much an effect on the economy as most people think. What do you think now?
Well, deep breath. Well, I think the first thing I have to say is anything any economist says should carry a large public health warning. You know, we're really good at getting things wrong, but here, where we have no data, no sort of data set, we have no precedent, we're really totally flying blind. That said, I think there are two things I'm reasonably sure about, and one thing which is, I think, more interesting that I'm not sure about at all. The two things I'm reasonably sure about is, one is we have an extraordinarily resilient economy. You think of all the stuff that's been thrown at it over the past 2 years, and if I were to say to you, okay, which in the last 6 months has been the fastest growing of the economies of Germany, Italy, France, or ourselves, we are, actually. We had a rather bit of a dip in the first half of last year. Second half, we're a lot faster. Well, Italy's in recession. Germany didn't grow. France grew a bit, but we probably grew more. You know, so, you know, very resilient. And I think that's a huge strength. And that stays. Second thing, this is the bad news, disruption is always damaging. And the more disruption you get, the more damaging it is. And I am deeply worried that the disruption which we have sort of held off to now will begin in earnest. And I really feel uncomfortable about what's going to happen. And if you say to me, okay, rank the various levels of Brexit by the damage they do, the answer is the softer, the better. I think there's no question of that. And people who are romantics saying, you know, let's break it all up, are actually just don't understand how companies work. And the third thing I'm not at all sure about really goes back to, does it really matter on a long view? It matters hugely on a short view, but 10 years from now, I think the things that will matter are how open are we to the world economy? How open are we to foreign talent? How open are we to investment? How do we look round the world as well as to Europe? All those questions, I think, will determine our success much, much more than this just in or just out. By the way, much easier to be just in.
Thank you, Hamish. Lizzie, what does Brexit mean for policing and for how safe we feel?
So Brexit has huge consequences for the way all law enforcement and judicial agencies work in the UK. Police have been preparing since the vote now for two main threats. The first one is the loss of intelligence and capacity they'll have through the European systems that all police officers currently use, mostly without even realising that they're using them. And the second one is the threat, which I'm sure we're all aware of today, of civil unrest and other forms of disruption that could have a security impact on London, Kent, and other parts of the UK that could be most affected. To deal firstly with the security arrangements that we currently use, some people who have campaigned for no deal would paint the systems we currently use as a bolt-on extra that the UK doesn't need. But actually they've become an integral part of the way police work. The Schengen Information System, which I'm going to shorten to SIS2 because we're all shy on time, that is used currently by police officers 539 million times a year. It's searched concurrently with the police national computer every time someone's arrested. So that means that whether a suspect is from the UK or from anywhere in the EU, they instantly know who that person is. They could be a criminal, they could be a terrorist, they could be no one at all. But that tool's also used by the border force. A lot of people also talk about enhanced border controls that we might get, but the fact is they're only as good as the intelligence you have when those people come in. So the loss of the Schengen information system is an absolutely huge implication for everyone in the UK. We also have tools like the European arrest warrant, and if we lose that, we'll have to fall back on very outdated extradition treaties. Some countries don't even extradite their own nationals, Germany, for instance, and that puts us in a very difficult position going forward. Theresa May's deal, as much as it has failed, clearly, as we've seen today, was actually the best case scenario for police and security agencies, because that gave a transition period and a political declaration that during that interim period, a bespoke security deal would be negotiated. And the feeling among police officers and security leaders in the UK was that because of the goodwill on both sides and the need for the EU to retain our intelligence and cooperation as much as we need theirs, that something could be negotiated which would almost be the same level in all but name as to what we have now, because for political reasons, some European countries might not accept people having exactly the same on paper rights as other EU member states. But the feeling was that that could be negotiated, and now, of course, it's all up in the air. So as it stands, if we do have a no-deal Brexit, police are much less effective than what we have, and that there is a real security risk that criminals either won't be detected in the UK or they'll go free. And my very last final point, because I realise I'm taking up too much time with all these very serious threats, is civil unrest and disruption. If anyone remembers some time ago the disruption that happened when there was issue with petrol supplies, that is one of the issues we could see again. If fears are realised about shortages to petrol, food, medicine or other supplies, that could generate serious civil unrest in several locations and fronts that police might find it very difficult to deal with. Also, if border crossings are slowed down at Dover, that's a serious issue that Kent Police have been given millions of pounds to deal with. And we also have pro-Brexit and far-right actors who have threatened to riot if they don't get the result they want. So at the moment, the police are extremely stretched.
Blimey. Thank you very much. I mean, there were some people making a lot of noise in Parliament Square today. Now, Kim, you travel around the world for The Independent. What has Brexit done to the way that other people see us in the world?
Well, the obvious people that we talk to, as you know, John, you're talking about diplomats, government ministers, the military, the intelligence services, and, you know, they are looking at it from their corporate point of view. I mean, today I was at a lunch with some foreign diplomats. The French ambassador had lunch a couple of weeks ago with Jacob Rees-Mogg, and as he pointed out, what Jacob Rees-Mogg told him then is entirely different from what Jacob Rees-Mogg is saying now. So they're living in a shifting landscape. Well, what is interesting tangentially is what ordinary people say, and there is, believe it or not, a lot of interest. Much more than I expected in places I go to, from the most unlikely people. I've been asked by a Chechen gangster in a nightclub in Moscow what it's like living in a banana republic. You know, being patronized by a Chechen gangster in a Moscow nightclub. There's a Turkish journalist who met Boris for the first time when Boris was Foreign Secretary, and he went to Turkey. And I remember running into him. I was coming out of Syria, and I went to a press conference he gave in Ankara. And there were no British journalists, and the embassy found out that I was there and shanghaied me to go. And Boris made a big thing about his Ottoman background and, you know, his Turkish roots, etc. Turkish journalist from Hurriyet newspaper took an interest because she, Boris claimed was a very good-looking young woman. Boris claimed was distantly related to him, and she had then taken an interest in Boris, his career, and then I remember discussing Boris with him. Now and this is a, you know, albeit a very experienced and brave young journalist, as you have to be in Turkey nowadays. Her brother is in prison, put in there by the Erdogan government, falsely accused of being a Gulenist, but she's still there, writing and free. And she has been studying Boris. In fact, she was thinking about writing a book in Turkish about Boris the Ottoman. And she emailed me today saying, how about this, Kim, as a scenario? So Boris has actually got what he has really always wanted. One is Prime Minister of the UK, and second is the UK staying in the European Union. Now, this is, I hadn't even thought about that, and this is just a throwaway, albeit tongue-in-cheek, email or text rather from a Turkish journalist. But I'm just saying that to show that there is a huge amount of interest. I think more so now. Initially there was shock, surprise, bewilderment, sadness after the referendum, and then, like everyone else, people just got thoroughly bored. But now, with the circus that's going on now, there is a rekindling of interest. People are just fascinated by, just what is going on and how it will end. I was sitting next to the French military attaché, and he turned at one point saying, what do you think is going to happen next? And I have to say to him, I have got no idea whatsoever. So I think it's this sense of uncertainty which is attracting people. Very quickly finishing off, all the arms of foreign policy, the Ministry of Defense, obviously the Foreign Office, Military Defense, DFID, etc., have been so consumed by Brexit and its twists and turns that there's been a sort of an atrophy, really. There hasn't really been any huge foreign policy initiatives in the last 2.5 years. But I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Kim. From one journalist who has no idea what's going to happen next to Andy Grice, who's going to tell us exactly what's going to happen after the events of today.
Well, as you know, Theresa May lost the third vote on her withdrawal agreement by 58 votes today, better than 230 or 149 in the first two votes. At this rate, I think she might get it through Parliament by about September. Unfortunately, from her point of view, she hasn't got that long. She's got to decide in the next 2 weeks whether to seek a long extension, probably 9 months, or leave the EU with no deal. Now, characteristically, the Prime Minister is not giving up. As I left Westminster after another day of drama today, the talk was that we were having yet another vote before the 12th of April. This will probably be a runoff between Theresa May's deal and any consensus which emerges on Monday from the indicative votes organised by a cross-party group of backbenchers. That consensus is probably going to be a customs union, possibly a referendum, a final say referendum, as urged by the Independent, of course, possibly a combination of a customs union and a referendum. We shall see what happens on Monday. If MPs can't coalesce around anything, then the runoff would be between Theresa May's deal and a long extension, a long delay to Brexit, and that would mean the UK taking part in the European elections in May, because we'd still be a member of the EU. There is another scenario, as Christian mentioned, a general election, which today cabinet ministers were talking up in the margins of the vote, not just to frighten the horses, the Tory MPs. So that is a real prospect now as a way of trying to break the deadlock between Parliament and the government, although no guarantee, of course, that an election would do that and come back with different parliamentary arithmetic. So in many ways, a better way of resolving the deadlock would be to put the issue back to the people, in my view. My final thought is that next week will be crucial, but then I've been saying that for about 12 weeks now.
Thank you very much, Andy. Now, who would like to ask a question? If you want to show your hands. Got one here. I've got lots of questions that have been sent in to us. I've got about 100 here. So I don't know if we're going to have time to get round to them all. But if you just want to indicate, and if there's a bit of a lull, I'll read out one of these. But let's go to the gentleman at the front. Could you stand up, and then the millions of viewers who are watching will be able to hear your question.
Is there still cooperation? Do we still have access to the systems? Or like your colleague said, do we kind of have to wait until next week to see what happens? I mean, where are we?
Good question. I mean, the thing is, yes, we don't know. It is absolutely remarkable that on the day we were supposed to be leaving, we still don't know. I mean, there are two completely different futures in front of this country. We could either be leaving on or about the 22nd of May, or we could, if something went horribly wrong, miscalculations on both sides. But if we do leave with a deal, is everything going to be all right, Lizzie?
Well, in terms of the security powers we have at the moment, everything is continuing until Brexit Day. And whenever Brexit Day is, it was going to be today, now it's not. That's when the first cut-off point will be, and then we'll fall back onto either no deal or onto some kind of transition period. If there is a transition, all the powers and systems and mechanisms we currently have will continue until the next cut-off period, if you know what I mean. So at the moment, it's all fine. The only thing that's not fine is that all police forces and other judicial authorities had planned for today being the day. They'd cancelled a lot of leave, they'd staffed up, they'd prepared in a way that they now won't be able to for whenever we do leave. So there's an increased risk there. And the other issue is just one of cost. Several £1 million have already been spent in preparations. Those preparations are carrying on. And also what's happened is that if effectively they've been pulling police officers and other experts from around police. As you know, we've got a crisis with violent crime at the moment. We've got a very high terror threat. And they can't keep taking resources for Brexit from other areas of our security infrastructure without there being consequences.
Thank you very much. We'll have a question from the gentleman there, but while we're waiting for the microphone, let me ask Andy. We've got a lot of questions here from people saying that our political system is broken, we need political reform, and in particular we need proportional representation, which, I mean, I personally don't see that connection, but what do you think, Andy?
I think that the Brexit debate has shown the weakness of our system. I think that there will, at the very least, be a proper debate whenever we get to life after Brexit in about 10 years' time. But seriously, there is a need for a debate. I think that some people are saying it's shown the flaws in Parliament. And Theresa May, as you know, in that rather ill-fated broadcast she did 10 days ago, blamed it all on Parliament, blamed the impasse on Parliament. I don't think it's been a failure of Parliament. I actually think that MPs are doing their job. They happen to disagree with the government, but of course there is a huge dispute, a collision between direct democracy in the 2016 referendum, which Parliament decided to do and hand over the decision to the people, and the MPs who now have to implement that decision. And many of them believe it would be, on the current withdrawal agreement, an act of economic self-harm, and so they are hesitating. But I do think we need to learn lessons from it. I don't think it's been a failure of Parliament. I do think it's been a failure of party politics in this country. And hopefully there will be a debate when we get time to reflect on what's happened. The problem with seeing proportional representation as a solution is that it's very difficult to see the circumstances in which either the Conservatives or Labour would implement that in government when they have a majority or something close to it. So how you get around that problem, I don't know. But we do need to find a way to do that, in my view, and we do need to, perhaps from the bottom up, build a movement for change to learn the lessons from the Brexit saga.
Brilliant. Right. Okay. Gentleman here.
Some newspapers, not The Independent, seem to say that the indicative votes first time round were a failure. I think that they were a great success in that they showed strong support for three particular points of view which were compatible. And how do you see the next round of indicative votes going? One of the striking things last time was that there were also about 100 MPs who didn't vote at all. Which way do you think they're likely to move, and how much depends on whipping.
Hamish, would you like to answer that?
I can't answer the...
No, but do you, indicative votes, do you think that's a good way of trying to solve tricky problems like this?
I think that there's a learning process that MPs have to go through. They're not used to having this power. And I think that they're gradually stumbling towards realizing they've got to try and be sensible. And I don't think they've yet got the stage that they could actually really be sensible, frankly.
Any more questions? Lady at the front here.
Yes, on your point about politicians being sensible, I was under the impression that when there was a referendum and the people gave their vote to Parliament, government, for what we wished, that they were supposed to act on that and not follow their own agendas. And it seems to me that we've been betrayed by our government and politicians in this, because there was a clear mandate from the people that hasn't been taken up by the politicians. They've followed their own politics and self-gratification and haven't delivered what was delivered to them by the people. And I would just like to say that our government went in to negotiate Brexit on remaining terms, and not as the people were instructed the government.
Thank you very much. That's a view that we needed to hear, I think. Who would like to comment on that? Kim?
Well, I think that there's certainly a view which is, I hear people say quite a lot. We probably don't see it reflected as much as we should, as John points out in Independent Guardian. But that is certainly a view. And what is interesting is in trips around Europe, when you speak to people who are supporting populist parties, they do see, rightly or wrongly, as Brexit as a template. Now, what I would say is that, the populists that I have personally spoken to in Italy, in France, and in Germany, haven't really said that they want to extract themselves totally from the European Union. Italy, they'll talk about leaving the euro, perhaps. So they haven't really said, in my experience, or rather very few have said that they actually want to leave the European Union. I think the bond is probably stronger there, even among the populists, than it is over here. However, one thing they do echo is the fact, they think that the European Union is a superstate. They think that people in Brussels do not listen to them, especially the white working class. And it's an issue which will be interesting, of course, see what happens in the coming European elections, and it's an issue which is simply not going to go away.
Those coming European elections that we're probably going to be taking part in. Who else would like to ask a question? The gentleman at the middle there. While we're waiting for the microphone, I've got a question from Mr. Bonfield about what people think about Emmanuel Macron's vision for Europe, and I wonder if people might want to address that later. But let's hear a question from the gentleman in the middle.
We live in we have a representative democracy, and Parliament is supposed to be the supreme maker of our laws and decisions. Under these circumstances, how can we have had a referendum which we're not supposed to, we're supposed to, carry on the decision made by the people, and yet Parliament has rejected the decision of Theresa May 3 times? How can she keep on bringing that back when Parliament has, having given it short shrift once was enough? It should never have been brought back again.
I should introduce you to the lady at the front here. you can have a discussion afterwards.
Because we live in a representative democracy.
But the representative...
One where we make decisions by referendum.
Of course, Hamish.
One thing? I mean, sure, I don't normally meet these people. I had conversations with 2 Labour MPs in the last couple of weeks. Both of them said they were going to support May, but just not yet.
Andy, you made the point about the conflict between direct and parliamentary democracy. What's your answer?
Yeah, it's a real dilemma, and it's very difficult to see how it's going to be resolved. A lot of prime ministers would have frankly given up by now and taken no for an answer. But Theresa May is not like that. She's absolutely wedded to her agreement, and she's going to give it one more shot in the next couple of weeks. So how it's resolved, I don't think she's going to get her deal through, but there is, as ever, a ray of hope for her in what's happened today. She's going to offer some new guarantees to try and win over Labour MPs by guaranteeing that Parliament would have a legal right in legislation to influence a second stage of the negotiations, a long-term trade deal. A lot of Labour MPs have been calling for that. The problem is that she only got 5 Labour MPs voting for her today, so she's probably going to need 25 or 30 to get some sort of majority. The other thing that could work in her favour next time is that some Conservatives, faced with a choice between a customs union and Theresa May's deal, more of the 30-odd Tory Eurosceptics who opposed her today might come round. But to answer the question, I think that she should obey the will of Parliament. And there are a lot of new facts have emerged about Brexit what it really does mean in the last 3 years. And the MPs are taking account of that. And there's also been a shift, not a massive one, but a shift in public opinion. All the poll of polls show that Remain would win if we had another referendum now. A lot of young people who couldn't vote in 2016 would vote Remain now. And so I think the MPs are right to stick to their guns.
Was there a question from a lady over here? Over there.
Given the rise of the independent group and the kind of discontent and seeming ineffectiveness of the 2 main parties, where do you see party politics going within the next year, 2 years, 3 years?
Well, that's a huge question, so we shan't answer it. But it is interesting that the independent group has called itself Change UK today. Lizzie, what do you think about the way party politics is going to change?
I think Brexit is an issue that all parties should have predicted would completely divide their own supporters. In a way, it's completely not a party political issue because it's never been on a manifesto before. So really, although the Conservatives had called the referendum, they should have realised what the impact would be on their party and on other parties when they did. And what I'm finding through my work, which admittedly is focused on quite dark online places related to extremism, is that Brexit has become a dividing issue that's far superseded previous loyalties. And you have very strongly pro-Brexit groups. The one currently headed by Nigel Farage is called the Brexit Party, although it's not a real political party, where actually if they got their act together, they could draw some serious numbers on Brexit as a single issue in a way that UKIP never could when it seemed like a very idealistic possibility that was never going to happen. So I think Labour and the Conservatives really have to watch their backs, both for defections against Brexit that we've seen with the independent group / Change UK, and also defections into potentially a pro-Brexit party.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm being told to wind up. I'm really sorry about that. I haven't been able to take nearly enough questions, but we can speak afterwards over drinks. Let me just quickly go around the panel and very unfairly ask, do you think we'll ever leave the EU?
Yes.
Lizzie?
Yeah.
Kim?
Sort of.
Andy?
Sort of.
Oh, that's a cop-out. That's a cop-out. I've been saying for weeks I don't think we're ever going to leave. So I think the independence campaign is winning. That's it. We now have a video for you, followed by Lara Spirit, who will be interviewed by Lizzie. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Femi from Our Future, Our Choice. I'm here with the Independent Final Say campaign at the Put It to the People March, finding out exactly why people know that we need a final say on this Brexit deal.
Well, I wasn't able to vote in the referendum. I'm now 19. I was campaigning at the time to remain.
Really want to remain in the EU. I don't see any benefits to Brexit. Economically damaging to everybody. I feel everybody's being conned by the charlatans and the Brexiteers. They're proven lies. I think the referendum was corrupt, and I think that's still to be found out.
I was devastated by the result in 2016. I mean, that's a memory I have very vividly in mind. And that's why I got so interested in all those youth groups and young activists getting involved to try and make sense of this, because this could have gone so differently, and we're here now 3 years later. It's crazy.
I mean, I don't understand how we've got this far and still have nothing to show for it. That's the worst point, isn't it? Like, 2 years and what we got absolutely cool.
I love your Twitter, man. You're awesome.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Absolutely love it.
What would, if you could say one thing to Theresa May, what would it be?
Resign. I was 7 days too young for the referendum the first time round.
And it's your future that is
And it's my future, yeah. And I campaigned like crazy, and then 7 days too young, and I didn't get to vote, and now I end up with this. So I'm pretty passionate about, like, let's get some sort of resolution. Let's stay in the EU.
Okay.
How do I feel about Brexit? I feel terribly depressed about the prospect of Brexit, and that's why we're here, because we're trying to do what you do every day, which is trying to express our view, which is stay, do anything to stay.
Because they're not listening to us.
No, they're not, and it's a disaster. Any deal is worse than what we've got.
Exactly.
And her deal isn't a deal. So please carry on the fight.
Thank you very much.
It's so good what you're doing. We're so proud of you.
Great to meet you. Brilliant. Appreciate it.
Here because we must remain in the EU and we must galvanise the support to do just that. Right now it's about numbers.
I've got friends who are terrified that he'll have to leave the country. There is no good side to this. It's so much damage being done already, and people imagine that if we either crash out or even have May's deal, that'll be it. That's it. That's over. No, we'll be in for at least 2 years, probably 10 years more of actually negotiating, arguing, debates. It will go on and on and on. You want to stop it? Vote to rescind Article 50 now. Then we'll all have a think about it.
Just reconsider. Listen to the people. Listen to the people. That's all it can be, isn't it? Surely.
So as you've heard, people are not happy with the way things are going. They want the country to be fixed, and they know that Brexit isn't the answer. They know that in order to fix this country, we need to vote down this Brexit deal. We need a final say on this Brexit deal, because if we end up with something that neither side actually wants, our country is broken permanently. That is why the people's vote, a final say, is the only answer to this absolute mess that we're in.
Just going to interrupt before we get on to the next part. Just because there was a very interesting question from down here. Someone asked about, from you, yes, exactly. And it ties in with the march and the campaign and everything. So I thought I'd just say something very briefly about the campaign. I think you're absolutely right to say that the MPs should be, the parliamentary process should have been delivering Brexit more effectively. One of the things that's sometimes confused about the Final Say campaign is that it's kind of swept along with a kind of anti-Brexit campaign. We didn't launch the campaign immediately after the Brexit vote. I think that a lot of people probably expected the Independents to do something about it because we were very much of the Remain camp. But we did respect the decision. It was only back in July. I'm looking at Will, who told me exactly which month it was now because it's all a blur. It was in July when we launched the campaign, at a point where the news agenda was dominated by the need to stockpile drugs in a country such as ours in peacetime, which seemed pretty extreme. And we do fundamentally believe there should be a good process. We do believe that there should be, we were predicting all along that the process of a meaningful vote could just turn into a kind of parliamentary strong-arming, which is pretty much what we're seeing now. So that's what we were campaigning about. And we did think that the people, having had 3 years pass and an awful lot of things either change or become an awful lot clearer, that people might want to have another say. But we do believe that a second referendum should be there for people of all opinions. We're not just trying to railroad that. We are saying that we believe that it's a campaign for people who want to remain. It's a campaign for people who want to leave, but who want to leave on terms that they approve of. Anyway, along the road of the campaign is where we came across Lara at that fantastic event that we saw on Saturday, where we saw people from all across the country, from all different walks of life, from all different age groups, and all different backgrounds, all coming together to express their opinion. So please do welcome Lara to tell us about the youth groups of the Final Say campaign. Thank you.
So yeah, for those of the... so yeah, just to do the full shebang, this is Lara Spirit, and she's one of the co-founders of a group called Our Future, Our Choice, which, as Christian mentioned, is a youth group. So if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about how that started and what you're campaigning to do.
Yeah, so we started a year ago. I was in my final year at university, and myself and 3 others left to start the campaign called Our Future, Our Choice. At that time, the People's Vote campaign, the Final Say campaign, didn't yet exist. But it became very clear to us since 2017, since the election, that Theresa May was going to have a very difficult time getting any form of Brexit through, and that come the autumn there would be some sort of intractable political gridlock. Obviously, it's been much worse than we originally anticipated. But it was resoundingly clear to us and to the young people at our university especially, who had been very complacent about the referendum and had expected Remain to soar through, had a real wake-up call, but felt appalled that the voices and the interests of young people hadn't played a part really in the referendum campaign. I think partly due to Jeremy Corbyn, hadn't played a part particularly since, even though age was a hugely defining factor in the referendum. And so we thought that a voice of the young and for the young was a very important factor and should exist, so we started it.
And this can be a very divisive issue when people talk about the voice of the young, the will of the young. Polls, however trustworthy they may or may not be, do show that Brexit vote is skewed towards older people and that Remain is skewed towards younger people. Sorry. And but there is a rise of some groups, including some operating at universities, that claim actually there's a larger proportion of young people who support Brexit and more right-wing views than feel able to make their views known. Do you think that, by and large, young people do support remaining in the European Union? And is there any way of telling really what people think?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, everybody's done consistent polling, and people doubt it. But in the polling that we've seen, not only did 3 in 4 young people vote Remain in 2016, but actually we now favour Remain by an even larger margin. And those 2 million young people who have come of age since 2016 favour Remain by an even larger margin. So we did a poll recently which showed 86% of those who have turned 18 since 2016 want to remain in the European Union, and the vast majority of them feel that they should definitely have their say. But yes, it is difficult, because I do think that some people feel that it's sort of a socially exclusionary thing to feel right-wing or to have pro-Brexit opinions at universities or as young people. I don't think that. I was at university less than a year ago, and I was exposed to many right-wing views and many right-wing people at university, and it always seemed a very, very healthy place to me. So I wouldn't say that, really.
And you mentioned that the polls show a very strong skew towards Remain, but is there any view of what would happen if there was a general election tomorrow? We discussed earlier how really this probably isn't a party political issue, but if that's the way the wind's blowing, do you have any feeling whether young people would still overwhelmingly support Labour, or whether they might be slightly frustrated with how that process has gone?
Well, this is why I think a general election is fundamentally the wrong way forward out of this crisis, because I think that Brexit is the defining issue of our age at the moment. It is the crisis that we would have to have a general election to sort out. And yet, if you have a general election, by definition, you're bringing in other issues. And I think that Jeremy Corbyn and also Theresa May, or whoever is leading the Conservative Party, would have a really tough job working out what Brexit policy would be on the manifesto. And I think you would have to see some sort of irrevocable splits in the party system for us to come to some sort of resolution in the Brexit impasse through a general election. And I do think that there was a huge amount of support among young people for Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 and before, during his election campaigns. But I would say that that is really wearing quite thin. We have hundreds of young people who have come to us in the last 6 months or so who are completely exasperated with his leadership on Brexit, feel really, really upset because they would say that they fit his views on many, many other things, but on this issue, which is the most pivotal issue for them, affects their futures hugely, they feel, or they felt as if there'd been a serious amount of triangulation. Actually, I'm happy because I feel like Labour are almost at the right place, and I do feel like Jeremy Corbyn is slowly but surely moving towards where I would like him to be. But that's why I have a real problem with general elections, because I think that, as we've said, the party system has been far outgrown by Brexit and the issues that have arisen from it.
And so if Brexit, for whatever reason, became less of a defining issue tomorrow, less of a political issue, do you think this energy that your campaign and other youth campaigns have seen would go into a new cause? Would people revert back to momentum in that pro-Jeremy Corbyn space, or would we just see a fracturing once again into individual issues?
Well, I think we've said that it's going to be almost impossible, really, to ever stop talking about Europe, at least for the next decade or so, especially if we pass this deal, because it gives us no clarity or closure about what our future relationship in the European is actually going to look like, and all of the torturous negotiations are going to continue for years to come. And I think part of that is that the issues that young people do care really strongly about, apart from Europe, are actually obviously completely linked to Europe. So if we think about cybersecurity or climate change, these are issues which young people care about hugely. You know, they're leaving school and leaving lessons to go and protest about it. But they fundamentally see that these issues, I don't think it's instantly translatable for us to, should Brexit go ahead, God forbid, and I am one of the people that thinks it won't, I don't think that young people would sort of just...
I'm going to open it up to the audience to see if you've got any questions. If I could remind you all to stand up and speak into the microphones so that our lovely listeners, wherever they may be, can hear you, that would be fantastic. We've got one gentleman in the middle here.
There is a middle-of-the-road left-wing political party that would, if there was a general election, would revoke Article 50 straight away and keep us in the European Union. Will you vote for them, the Lib Dems?
Thank you for the reminder.
If anyone was in doubt. My personal, and I've always voted for the Lib Dems, and I would continue to do so, but my personal view on this issue is that I do think that it would need a democratic resolution, and I haven't signed the petition to revoke Article 50 for that reason, although I really recognise that the sort of expression of frustration and anger in the millions who signed it is incredibly important and should definitely be listened to. I would certainly favour revocation over something like no deal, but I do think that if we are ever to revoke Article 50, that there would need to be a referendum and a people's vote in order to have some sort of semblance of moving beyond the divisions that we've had. But there are others in our movement who feel very differently to me. It must be worth pointing out.
And do you think that students could or would be mobilised to vote for the Lib Dems again, or do you think the scars from 2010 are still remembered?
No, definitely. I mean, there was at my university, young people were mobilising, I would say, very strongly in favour of the Liberal Democrats. I do think that there is a serious space for them, and there is a massive appetite for a pro-European political force. But there is obviously stuff that people want to see from the Lib Dems, definitely.
Excellent. Any more questions? There's a gentleman here. There's two. I think the gentleman with the pen put his hand up slightly before.
Thank you. After this afternoon's vote, there's just a very real possibility that we could leave the European Union without a deal. And I was wondering, in the light of that enormous petition for revoking Article 50, whether, frankly, given the circumstances, do you think that Parliament could be minded to revoke Article 50 rather than risk no deal?
I think if it came to it, you would have people, you know, your Greg Clarks and David Gawkes, etc., who would rather revoke than have no deal. But I think what we heard earlier from somebody in the audience, that the indicative votes process was very useful in highlighting that actually there is an alternative which can try, or we think could command a majority in the House, and that could include, I think will include, hopefully, a people's vote, and that is, I think, the best way to avoid a no-deal scenario. But yes, I do think I would feel safe. Yes, no, but I would, you know, Parliament, if it can't decide on anything, and it can't decide on anything, if it has one very clear wish at the moment, I think that genuinely is to avert no deal, and I feel maybe misguidedly confident about it, but yeah.
And we have the gentleman in the front here.
Yeah, it's interesting, really. Shall I stand up? Shall I stand up?
They can hear you, Greg.
I'm all right. And we were told about the Moonies. You know, be careful of the Moonies because they were out to get you. But I don't remember right-wing people at university. I mean, it's a different era. You know, I do not remember right-wing people running around with, you know, these kind of...
So if you wouldn't mind just speaking speaking directly into the mic, because otherwise...
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, that's good.
My question really is, where have these special interest groups come from and what do they hope to achieve individually? Why are they not aligning themselves with political parties?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I mean, for us, obviously, if you take the case of Brexit and a people's vote, we have MPs who support us from all parties, and we have young people who support us who affiliate themselves with every single different party and with none. You know, I'm not affiliated with a political party. And on an issue such as Brexit, where you are appealing to MPs of different parties, and we're saying it sort of transcends the party political system, that's very important. But on other issues, I'm actually not so sure. I mean, we talked earlier about Turning Point UK, who, I don't know if anybody's heard them, but they're a sort of right-wing implant group from the US, and it's unclear where they're funded from, but they had a rocky start here, but they sort of champion, you know, free market liberal ideas, but more importantly, they believe that there's been a sort of culture of suppression in free speech at universities, and that there's been this culture of no platforming, and that there's this sort of toxic culture of liberalism which sort of monopolizes everybody and means that nobody can say what they think. And actually, I don't believe that to be the case at all. But I do think that those movements are gaining some traction. And they are important, and they're not affiliated with parties, but if you go down their Twitter thread, you know, they are incredibly anti-Labour and they're incredibly anti the independent group. So there is a way to sort of delineate that and work out some affiliations, but I suppose it just depends what your goal is.
It just seems strange, you know, we weren't extreme in any way. You know, my generation, you know, we didn't... Oh, right. We didn't... how can I say this?
I will say we've only got 2 minutes on the clock, so if there's another question, it would be great if you could shorten it just so we can come to these people.
I'll let other people have their say. Okay. Thank you.
I will briefly answer that question though and say the internet allows young people to network and generate slightly more unusual and fringe views in a way that they might not have done when people were offline. And personally, I think that's some of the reason that we've seen increasingly what were viewed as fringe views now entering very public discourse on social media and in other ways in universities. But we have a lady here. Thanks.
Hi. Bearing in mind this is probably a vote against status quo rather than a vote against pro or anti-Europe, when there is a result either in or out of Europe, there's going to be a huge amount of people who are going to be very unhappy. So what would you suggest the government did to restore a status quo so that we can continue in a healthy country?
Yeah. What a question. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, some people would argue that the status quo was intolerable, which was one of the reasons, you know, why we had the Brexit vote, and therefore, you know, we have to have a conversation about a different kind of politics, which I partly agree with. I do think that there will be a general election soon, whether or not we have a people's vote, and that will help in some way to talk about what sort of reforms we need. My personal view is that politics has to be rebalanced to reflect, talk to, and invest young people in politics more, because I feel like we have been incredibly ignored. I feel like Brexit brought that into sharp focus, and I do feel like any politics that comes in future has to treat young people like an important voting bloc as they do anybody else. And I hope that this is one way of getting there.
Okay, unfortunately, that is the end of this part of the session. I'm so sorry. You can harangue us afterwards. And shortly, you'll be hearing from Christian, who will be speaking to Vince Cable, who, of course, as the leader of the Liberal Democrats, has been very strongly campaigning for both a people's vote and Remain. So thank you so much. And thank you again for all your really interesting questions. Thank you.
Really raised this issue. We've given a focal point to this issue. I think that the Independent can do that uniquely because it's a trusted news organisation, it's not a political party, there's no secret agenda. We set out everything that we thought about it on day one. You know, we're not here to rule on exactly what happens with Brexit, we're just here to give our readers and people who want to be associated with us a voice in this process.
We built this campaign at a point where people were dismissing it as a not realistic prospect, to one where over 1 million people signed this petition. The Independent, of course, worked with the People's Vote to put on a huge march that we had in October with over 700,000 people on the streets. Now, the other side of the argument, who have been arguing for this extreme break in our relationship with the European Union, they have not been able to deliver anything like the same at all. And that is because ultimately Brexit in the form that they promised we could get it has proved to be undeliverable.
Prime Minister herself has said this is the most important thing that will shape our country for decades to come. Well, she's right, and that's why people should have a final say. So today we'll be getting that message across to her and hoping that a government responds to that.
Well, I think it's very important that people keep up pressure on their MPs. We've got very close now. I think the enormous mobilisation of the People's Vote, it's a magnificent popular campaign, but we shouldn't slack off at the last minute. And I think events of this kind, just keeping it in the public eye, are absolutely essential.
The very important work of taking a selfie at number 10. That's what it's all about, really. Well, Vince, thank you very, very much for joining us here today. You've been campaigning for a referendum longer than I have, so I'm probably not the person to sit here and give you a grilling over the wisdom of that, although maybe some people in the audience might later. But you're a fantastic person to have here on this particular evening, where we are all scratching our heads, wondering what on earth is going on. The discussions on our news backbench have taken a turn for the surreal sometimes, where we try to interpret what's going on in the House. And you're a man with some experience there. So my first question for you is that Theresa May suggested that the process has run its course after the vote today, into which you can interpret an election or something else needs to happen. In that crystal ball of yours, where do you see, I mean, we can say, maybe there's a meaningful vote coming back to the House. We can say that with certainty there'll be some more arguments next week. Does this lead to an election? Does this lead to a referendum? Can the referendum that we've been championing actually happen, do you think?
Well, I think there are all kinds of scenarios. There are three plausible ways forward in the next few weeks. One of them is that on Monday, Parliament comes to a clear view in support of one option or another. And one of the good runners is a composite of the Customs Union, which Ken Clarke put forward, and a People's Vote, right? That, I would say, stands a good chance of getting through. Or you could have the Customs Union on its own, which actually probably stands a better chance of getting through. And then Theresa May goes to the Council, June the 12th, I think, and gets approval for a long extension, and then with the long extension, we eventually unravel all this tangle that we've got into. So I think that's the optimistic view. The pessimistic view is that she goes to the ministers, has very little to offer. They say, well, look, we're just fed up with this. You know, the doors have closed. We have no deal. You know, you sort the problem out in Britain. We'll manage as best we can. I think that's the worst, and that is still plausible. And in between the two, there is, I think, the very real possibility of early election. It doesn't solve any problems, but if you look back at historical precedents when the constitutional system has collapsed, I mean, I was just thinking a little bit about this. I think probably the nearest is when the House of Lords turned down Lloyd George
was it 1908, 1909? They finished up having 2 general elections in a year to try to get a new settlement.
How many can we have?
Well, indeed, it temporarily solved the problem, but it also opened the way to a fundamental recasting of British politics. That was the beginning of the crack, which eventually led to the death of the Liberal Party.
Well, you've been hoping for, well, hoping, maybe that's stating too much, but you've been commenting about the chances of a crack happening in our politics, something disrupting the 2 big behemoths there, the Labour Party and the Tory Party. People have speculated separately and together that both parties may face a split, from which perhaps a centre ground party could rise. How likely do you think that is? Do you think that one party has got more problems than the other holding itself together? Talk us through that.
Well, I desperately hope that something does happen. I mean, I think as a country, we're in
for one of the parties to split.
Well, both actually.
Both.
No, and I think for the first time in my lifetime this is possible. I mean, I think one shouldn't.
Isn't Britain's strength been that it's had a stable, predictable political system where
while
one or other
the 2
party
parties
wins?
represented something in a coherent way, and I think that's breaking down. But let me just explain my argument. I mean, it is incredibly difficult to change the British political system. I mean, I've been through the SDP alliance experience. I was a candidate when the SDP happened in '83. It is very, very, very difficult to break the mold because of the way the voting system operates. And right now, if there were a general election, the TIG group, for example, would be wiped out. They haven't got an infrastructure. But nonetheless, I mean, I'm optimistic that if we have time, something will emerge from this crisis which is positive on both sides. But, let me just say, I think within the last few days, I've been having conversations with deep-dyed Tories. I mean, the kind of people you would never regard as wet or one-nation Tories. You know, they're sort of the kind of decent, middle-of-the-road type Tories that we used to encounter once upon a time. And they say, look, you know, we've just had it up to here. You know, we just cannot take any more of it. Our party has been infiltrated by, you know, the right-wing equivalent of Momentum. We've been threatened in our seats. We're having to get legal advice. I mean, you know, they're in a terrible state, those moderate Tories. And then on the Labour side, you have one desperate effort being made by Tom Watson, who is a, you know, very formidable and impressive guy, to try and save the Labour Party. But I think even those who like him and hope for the best are pretty pessimistic, because the hardliners have complete control, and as long as Unite and CWU and the rest of them are willing to back the leadership, there's no way of changing the structure of the Labour Party. And so you may well find that if this crisis continues for much longer, that both of the traditional parties do split. And that then creates, in a way, the perfect condition for something new and better.
Is the new and better thing the independent group, or Change UK?
Well, I think that's the first stage in something much bigger. I mean, I think they're impressive people, they're brave people. I think we have a lot in common with them. We're already talking to them constructively.
You voted, all the MPs from both the Lib Dems and the independent group, as it was then, voted in very similar, if not completely identical ways in the indicative voting process.
Yes, we did. We didn't.
By coordination or by happenstance?
Well, we talk. You know, there are all kind of little practical day-to-day ways in which we are trying to cooperate.
And
it may gel or it may not. It's certainly, as long as I'm leader, I'm keen to bring us together. I mean, there are tribal people in any organisation who, you know, won't work like that. But I'm personally determined that as long as I'm around, we do our best to bring these people together.
And in the event of a general election, have you discussed yet whether the Lib Dems would field candidates in seats such as, say, Streatham or South Cambridgeshire?
Well, I've expressed the view in my own party that I think it would be foolish and short-sighted to take a fight with, you know, what are basically very good people who share our values. But, you know, as I say, there are you know, there are tribal people in every party who won't give way. And it's you know, we are a democratic organization. We have processes. It's not straightforward. But my instincts is that we should be as helpful as we can.
So if we have two centre ground groupings or parties, as Change UK will be, working together, this now starts to sound a little bit like are we heading into an era of coalitions or permanent hung parliaments, or is that a bad thing? Is it a good future if we? I mean, lots of European governments don't have the quote-unquote stability that the British.
Well, it depends what you mean by instability. I mean,
well, they have groups
there's nowhere in Europe except
collaborate.
Possibly Italy that's got the kind of chaos that we have.
Absolutely, but it's through that kind of collaboration that you've just described that other countries have managed to form some form of stability. Do you think if we headed into a decade of, rather than people are talking about if this happens, the Tories could be out of power for a decade, etc., could we actually just be heading into a coalition-based time of our politics?
Well, I think that is actually a grown-up way to run countries. I mean, I was a coalition cabinet minister for 5 years. I'm not a natural friend of the Tories. I always consider myself centre-left. I've always consider them the enemy, as it were, politically. But actually, it's perfectly possible to operate, as I and some of my colleagues tried to do, on the basis that, well, you know, when you go into the office, you leave your weapons at the door and you get on and do a job. And that's what coalition is about. And I would have thought that in a grown-up political environment, that's the kind of system we should be working for.
We all thought back then that was an extraordinary time for politics. It seemed, I mean, compared with today, you look back and you think, you know, maybe not so much. But what was the most shocking thing you found? I mean, it was a coalition government seemed shockingly new then, in a sense, and seeing your party work together with Cameron's Conservatives must have thrown up some extraordinary. So, what was the most shocking thing you learned during your time in coalition?
Well, I think there were. I mean, we had, you know, we came out of it politically very badly, as you know. Not actually, I think, because of the coalition. There's a little bit of rewriting of histories happen. When you actually look back on the 2015 election, we were voted out and we had a disastrous election, not primarily because people rebelled against the coalition. There was some of that. You know, some of my Twickenham vote went to Labour and the Greens, but not very much. The main thing that happened was a switch to the Tories. Mm-hmm. They frightened people very successfully with this horror story of Labour and the SNP, and it worked. And they very, you know, it was brilliantly executed, but absolutely toxic in terms of its subsequent effects, that they sort of poisoned the whole idea that parties could work together sensibly, and we got the government we've now got, and you've seen the result. I want to get back to an environment in which I would feel perfectly comfortable working with sensible Tories and sensible Labour people. There are lots of them around, but they're not on their front benches.
Bearing that experience in mind, have the independent groups sought your advice on how to form a party, what not to get wrong, how to work with others?
Well, yes, I mean, we talk. I mean...
What do you think is the most useful advice you have managed to give them or could give them?
Well, I think the most useful advice is that the political system we operate under, the first-past-the-post system, is potentially lethal to you and us if we compete with each other.
Right.
I mean, we can't compete with them or them with us because it will destroy us both. I mean, it would be an absurd thing to do because we'd simply be, you know, splitting the centrist vote under a first-past-the-post system. So they are going to have to collaborate with us. At the moment, they have the zeitgeist, you know, the enthusiasm, the sense of new and change, and that's great. I think, you know, a lot of people are aching for that. We have a bit of that, and we're in the right place on Europe, and we also have an infrastructure. And if we combine the two, then you've got a formidable force.
Were you surprised to see the leadership emerge to be Heidi Allen rather than Chuka Umunna?
No, I think it's...
Interim leadership, I should say more.
No, I think, I mean, they're both capable people in different ways. I don't think, as I understand the way they work, which is quite like the way we work, it's quite a horizontal structure. I mean, I'm the leader of my party, but I don't order people around. We work as a team, and I think they're probably operating in the same way. And I think that's a healthy, modern way to run organizations.
You've, speaking of your leadership of the Liberal Democrats, you've indicated before that you may see another future ahead for yourself, that you might want to invite somebody else to come and lead the party. If there's an election called very soon, of course, there may not be much chance to change leadership. Do you think you would lead
yes,
the party
I would.
through
I
that?
mean, I've made it very clear. If there's an election before July, which is when a new Lib Dem leader would emerge, I would be leading us into an election. I mean, I have mixed feelings about it, but I would be doing it.
And beyond?
Not beyond, no.
Okay.
If we get a new leader in place, if we have a general election in September, then that new leader would be doing it.
And have you thought at all about life after I mean, would it be life after frontline politics? Would you leave politics? Would you be tempted to go do something else with? I mean, how many years have you been in the House now?
20.
20.
Yeah, I have absolutely no ambition to go to the House of Lords. I mean, that's, absolutely none. I mean, I have two personal things I want to do. I like writing books. I've been quite successful at it. So I've got my next book or two planned out. And I keep up my weekly dancing lesson, and I was starting to go to Blackpool for competitions, and I want to get back to that. Yeah.
Great. So no, you haven't had Facebook on the line then, offering another Liberal Democrat?
Well, I'm not interested. Actually, I am interested in companies and how they work.
Well, you were
one of the things I do. I mean, I don't publicise it, but I am chairman of a company. I mean, I'm not paid; it's a voluntary thing. But it's the country's biggest social enterprise, and it's a bus company, and brilliant organisation, and it helps me to keep in touch with the world of business and how things are done in that environment. I don't spend much time on it, but it's a great thing to do. So I mean, I do like, I'm not interested in going to Facebook and earning 10 million a year or whatever, but I am interested in having a foothold in the world where things are made to happen.
Is there something slightly unseemly about politicians who go and take jobs in controversial companies where they may have had policy interest before? The kind of life after politics is an interesting subject. I'm thinking of the Facebook example, I suppose.
I'm not criticising my former boss. I mean, he's left politics.
Former, of course.
Yeah. No, I mean, I worked for Shell before I became an MP, which is a pretty controversial company, and I was heavily involved in all the dramas around Brent Spar and Nigeria. I found that actually an illuminating experience, and I think I did good stuff when I was there, but simply being associated with controversial companies is not something people, should back away from.
And final question then before we throw to other people who I'm sure have questions for you too. If you imagine a time without Brexit, hard to do, of course. If you imagine a time without Brexit, beyond Brexit, so that Britain does actually leave the European Union, would the Liberal Democrats become the party of rejoin?
We might well. It's a very difficult question now, and I do want to make sure that if we get to that point, and we're a long way from it, and I believe and hope that it won't happen, but if we did, I think we may well. But I want this to be properly debated and discussed with my colleagues, because rejoining would not be a simple problem. I mean, under the current rules, you would have to join. Comprehensively, you'd have to join the monetary union, you'd have to join Schengen. I'm not sure that there's much of an appetite for that in the UK at the moment. Maybe you can create some bespoke arrangement. I mean, our instincts are to be as close to Europe as possible, and certainly that's something we will fight for. Whether rejoining is feasible on the current basis, I don't know. I think what we perhaps should be looking ahead to is the kind of picture that Macron has been painting, which is that there is a kind of inner core which is highly federated. I'm not sure there is much of an appetite for it even in Germany, but in which the core countries are very closely integrated economically, politically, militarily. And then you have another group, which would be the Scandinavians, the East Europeans, the Southern Europe, which should probably include us, but who are very firmly part of the European Union and committed to it, but nonetheless not part of that totally integrated project. So that may be a picture that sort of gradually emerges in the next few years.
So would you therefore take very soft Brexit versus referendum if it were on the table now?
No, we're going to stick with the referendum message.
Good for you. Excellent. Should we cut to some questions now, just so I'm conscious of time? But first hand went up right over the back. Sorry, we'll come to you just next, but right over the back there was the first hand that shot up.
Sir Vince, this might sound a bit harsh, but I've got to say it. We've got a situation where it's 50-50 Brexit, maybe 55-45 Remain. We've got a situation where the leaders of the two main parties are universally thought of as relatively useless. You're probably brighter than the two of them put together. You've tonight answered any question and would do much more than those two parties. So why the Lib Dems sub 10% in the polls? I just don't get it. Surely, I mean, it's not a general election, but in a poll, you should be polling much higher. You are the party of Remain and maybe over half population of Remain. So why so low?
The simple answer is that opinion polls are a very poor guide to voting behavior under a first-past-the-post system. I can envisage a situation in which our poll numbers double to over 20%, and we have fewer MPs. You know, that could easily happen. I mean, I was a candidate in '83 when the SDP Liberal Alliance were formed. We got up to the mid-20s. We overtook the Labour Party shortly before the election. And there was just a handful of MPs came back because, the problem is that all the opinion polls tell you is that spread across the country, this is your level of support. It doesn't tell you anything about your capacity to get MPs elected. I mean, it is an absolute pain from our point of view. I mean, we'd love to be up there in high numbers. I would get on the news a lot more if it happened. But in terms of getting MPs elected in Penzance or Caithness or East Fife or wherever it is, it's completely irrelevant. I mean, the position at the moment is, it's not brilliant, but it's encouraging in the sense that when I took over, our ratings were about 7%, which they'd been at the two previous elections, had been for the last 8 years, actually, since the beginning of the coalition. They're now 11-12, which is roughly what it was at the beginning of the '97 election when we had our big breakthrough. And we doubled our number of MPs to 46. And if there was an election and we had a good election, and the potential is good given the strong Remain passions running in the country, in parts of it, then we could do equally well. But I just go back to my basic point, that opinion poll ratings have no bearing on your performance in number of MPs, or little bearing.
And sadly, election results, I mean, to extend the pain momentarily, the election results must have been a disappointment the last time round, since you had such a distinct position on Europe. Do you think that the
I think there's a very important point there that was actually
better?
Missing from your earlier discussion.
Yes.
We did very badly again in 2017, and one of the reasons was that the second referendum message went down like a lead balloon. I mean, including in my constituency. I didn't talk about it. I talked about school cuts and things like that. It was very clear, I think, then, it's less so now, that people didn't want to just rerun the referendum. What they did want, and this was palpable when you were actually campaigning, they wanted a government that would somehow accept the result, but in a way that bound in the 48% who voted the other way. That was the strong sense we had. The big mistake and the big dividing, the point at which it all went wrong, was the Lancaster House speech. It was when the government decided, Theresa May and her main advisor, that they were solely interested in maintaining Conservative Party unity. So they adopted commitments which were in their manifesto, but which were bound to alienate the 48%. It took us out of all the economic arrangements of the European Union. It created unintentionally, they didn't realize this at the time, the backstop problem, which of course has divided the Tories themselves, ironically. But that was the moment where it all went wrong. It was the Lancaster House speech. It wasn't the referendum itself.
Mm-hmm.
It was what happened subsequently.
Interesting. Yes, sir. Sorry, we've got the microphone just coming to you.
Do you think that Theresa May has the stubbornness of Stalin, or elements of Mr. Bean, or do you have a different analogy this time?
Well, I've never encountered anybody quite like the Prime Minister. And I dealt with her a lot in the coalition, as you know. And no, there is something that doesn't actually quite come out in the public perception, because when she's standing at the dispatch box or making speeches, she's very strident and sort of shouty, and it gives the impression of a kind of robot speaking. When you actually meet her privately, she's extraordinarily charming and pleasant and companionable. But the views don't change. It's the very rigid mindset that's the problem, rather than her manner. And I encountered it throughout the coalition, because I was always quarrelling with her about immigration policy. I had responsibility for the British industry and for universities. And so we were potentially badly hit by her insistence on the 100,000 immigration cap, particularly overseas students. And so I was fighting with her the whole time about it. And I would get these late-night calls, which I would recognize when I heard the voice, I'm very disappointed, Vincent. It was done in a very kind of quite feminine, pleasant way, but her views were never changed. They were absolutely fixed.
Sorry, I'm not looking over this side of the room. I will do in a moment. Pink top there, yes.
Thank you. Following on from Theresa May's stubbornness, should the conclusion be reached either by Parliament or by referendum, is there a way in which Theresa May could actually not carry that instruction through?
Yeah, yes, I think so. I mean, I described it earlier. I mean, if she feels obliged or is mandated to go back to the European Council of Ministers and seek a long postponement, she will probably be signing the death warrant of Brexit. And she knows that. Actually, that's what that was the interesting thing about her speech today. It wasn't really addressed to us at all. It was addressed to her own people, saying, look, if you vote this down, Brexit's finished. Now, to some extent, she was saying that for effect, in order to frighten them. But I think she now means it. I think what she's really saying, look, I've done my best for you lot, behind her. From now on, if you lose your Brexit, well, okay, I've done my bit. I mean, I think that was her message today.
In the front here.
I'd just like to say that she didn't deliver Brexit. So even whatever form she's put it forward in, a Brexit hasn't been delivered. It's been a compromise. But what I would like to say is, I would like to ask you your point of view on career politicians in all parties. And I feel that there's more and more problems across all parties, with politicians now becoming career politicians without any real experience in any part of business or social or any kind of administrative life at all. They only get trained in politics. And I feel that we're losing a lot now with the quality of our politicians, because of their lack of the kind of experience that somebody like you does have. And I think that also, when it comes to the students who are voting to remain in Brexit, I can quite understand that because they don't have the experience of what other people have had about not being in Europe before, which is really, life is not frightening without being in Europe. And there is a life outside Europe that other people manage to live. And it's all this stuff about a lack of experience across the parties and in the people who are, you know, expressing their opinions about what is happening now.
Thank you. Sorry, just mindful of the time. So the question would be there, would the situation we're in be any better if we had fewer career politicians and actually had some more life experience in the House?
I suspect every generation says the present crop of politicians is the worst we ever had. Not sure.
Wait till you see
true.
the next bunch, right?
Until you see the next one, yeah, yeah. No, I'm not sure I agree with you. I mean, it's a flattering question because I'm probably one of the few people who spent most of my life doing other things, but I'm not sure it's true. I mean, there is an art to politics, right? It is the art of negotiation. I mean, we're failing at the moment, obviously. You know, there is one of the really great political science books by a man called Bernard Crick, which is called In Defense of Politics. And it basically defines those societies which are capable of solving their problems peacefully as a result of political processes rather than through authoritarian systems or whatever. And we do that. I mean, in my more optimistic moments, and it is difficult at the moment, I just reflect on the fact that in this country at the moment there is so much anger and so much frustration, but actually we're dealing with it peacefully. We're dealing with it in a parliamentary way. It may be a mess, it may not be ideal, but I can't think of many countries in the world where we'd be doing it this way.
That's a very good subject that hasn't been raised yet directly. About the division in the country. As a politician with a reputation for not taking extreme views and for compromising and for finding ways through, and for working under a coalition as the smaller of the two partners, you're a good person to ask. How can Britain heal its wounds after Brexit? Whatever happens, whatever the outcome, whether it's a referendum or a long delay, we've got people marching in outside Westminster today, not looking very happy about the situation. We had another group of people marching last Saturday. How do we bring everything together?
Well, it sort of links up with the previous question. I mean, what I do find a bit bizarre is that amongst the politicians, you don't have this hostility. Actually, I mean, I'm walking through Parliament and you bump into Bill Cash or Rees-Mogg or somebody, and they'll stop and say hi, how are you, etc. You know, there is that sense that we're part of the same democratic thing and we behave in a civilized way. The problem we have is that out there, if I can call it that, these divisions are now becoming very, very bitter, but they're quite complex. I mean, the biggest division is actually between generations. And it's the difference of interests of the young and the old over Europe, but not just over Europe, over housing and other issues. So that's, the intergenerational equity problem is very profound, and we've got to deal with it. And it's not easy, but, we've got to pursue, housing policy in a much, much more radical way than we have hitherto. There are regional differences, but they're not as simple as people sometimes say it's a north-south issue. I mean, I come from York, and, there are prosperous, successful cities in the north of England. All the big cities voted to remain. The poorest cities voted to remain. It wasn't rich versus poor, north versus south. It's complex. So how you heal these divisions is quite complex. And perhaps just to lead on to your conclusion, I have a little pamphlet outside, which you're all going to get when you go home, which actually tries to address this problem.
Austerity. Could I mention austerity? It's often said that I mean, we're running slightly over time, by the way. I hope that's okay for everybody, but it's a good discussion. Let's keep it running just for a couple more minutes. When you're looking to heal the wounds and you're looking to bring people together and you're looking at the causes of the Brexit reaction and urge towards Brexit, austerity is something that often comes up. It's something that's been very much a factor of your time in the House. Do you feel it's a big divisive issue that is top of the agenda to heal Britain post-Brexit?
But what on earth does this word austerity mean? I just get so frustrated with these arguments.
Well, public spending cuts. Let's call it public spending cuts and severe public spending cuts have happened over a number of years.
If you define it more precisely like that, then I buy into it. We should have more public spending, especially more public investment, but then you've got to pay for it. So you have more taxation. I'm willing to go into a general election, probably as the only party leader who will say we should have higher taxation in order to fund more public spending. That is not going to be a very popular message, because what people often say when they want less austerity is that, well, we want more spending, but somebody else should pay, which is not the way you can run a country.
So staying to looking at the future then, just for the final thoughts, spend more, tax more, another referendum. What else would you be looking to put in that manifesto when it's put together?
Well, I think education, going back to Mr. Blair, I think is absolutely top of the list. Unless, as a country, we could get world-class education at sort of Finnish levels, I mean, that is the country's future, and it's going down the drain at the moment. So education, environmental issues are being, in my view, I mean, I think the idea of a climate change emergency, I know it's a cliche, but I think that should be a central message. And then I would put housing up there because of the generational question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Optimistic then? Year's time? 2 years' time?
Yes, I'm always optimistic, actually. I know this is a very difficult time, but I'm optimistic about the country, actually. I mean, despite the awful, awful mess around Brexit, I think we have a good potential for coming out of it in the right way. I think there is still a very good chance that what the Independent and others have been fighting for, the people's vote, getting people to vote to stay, I think that's still very much on the cards. I'm optimistic we can win that battle. I'm actually optimistic about the country, actually. I mean, I'm not going around waving a Union Jack, but I think there are a lot of good things about the country, and I'm proud of it. It sounds a bit sentimental, but
that was a great way to end the evening. I wondered where this evening would take us. I didn't necessarily expect it to take us to optimism, but I think we'll all take some of that. Vince and everybody else, thank you very much for coming here tonight. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.